Well, thank you for coming this morning. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Be present with us, Christ. Open our arms, open our eyes, open our hearts to you and to our neighbors, to share love, to share forgiveness, to work towards healing and reconciliation where it's needed, and joy and help where it can bring hope. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so this is the second part of my sabbatical recap. It's hard to recap all this time in, 35, 40 minutes, whatever I'm going to do. And some of this, like with Italy, some people have been to Italy and knew those different type of things. That was last week. And then this week are the things that I did stateside. Mainly, as you can see from this slide, the Trail of Tears, which I'll talk about first, and then also Civil Rights Trail. And there are books on the tables there behind you. One about the whole trail, which I didn't do the whole thing. I did parts of it, but predominantly spending time in Montgomery and then in Birmingham at different museums and different places there, including the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, which you may remember the just unbelievable bombing of that church. So part of how I've phrased this in my own head as things that end with the letter Y. So last week was Italy or winery or all those other kind of things. And the things that end with Y in this case, which was a little bit of humility, a little bit of legacy. Because the legacy, as someone who grew up in the South, the legacy of slavery and how I experienced its remnants, and then how I've learned about it. The legacy of the Trail of Tears, which I really knew very little about. And I have to say, I give credit to Bishop Jose, who a few years ago at our clergy retreat had people come from, in the wider Episcopal Church, there is a department, for lack of a better term, of indigenous ministries. So whether on this continent, whether that's in Wyoming or New Mexico, or North Carolina, how are we ministering to indigenous people in this land and getting to hear their side of the story? And so much of this sabbatical for me was listening and learning and trying to hear what they say is where their hurt is. A doctor can come in and make a diagnosis, but if you're really talking to the patient, it's like, okay, where does it hurt? And you begin to listen, you see where some of that pain comes from and the emotional, spiritual pain that we've experienced in the past few years with things that have happened with George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or any number of people who have been harmed and the protests that followed that, just like Rodney King, just like you go down the list of folks, of Black people and what that feels like and why, when something else happens, does it cause such turmoil in the country? Not just for Black people, but for white people who see that, who want an end to that kind of injustice. But where did that start? And so I want to talk some about both of these and try to do it as we go through these slides. I'll share with you some of the books that I read, but I'll also be able to put those on the website eventually too. So if you're interested in reading any of those things, if you haven't read them, that I invite you to do that too. So I'm going to stand over here with my little cheat sheet and the clicker and try to go through. One of the things that's happened that I discovered over the past few years with the Trail of Tears is that through the national parks system, local communities have been given grants to put up road signs of where the Trail of Tears may have gone through. Okay, so here's probably the last time I really thought about the Trail of Tears was 8th or 9th grade, right? You heard about it and you think it's one trail, like the Appalachian Trail is one trail. And you think it happened at one time and it took 9 months. Well, it actually sort of happened over a 20-year period and multiple venues as people who had been inhabiting these lands for maybe 13,000 years were escorted out. And it's really not an overstatement to call it ethnic cleansing, because it is taking out an ethnicity who you no longer want there. Maybe not completely through murder, but there was that. But also just it's time for you to move on because we are moving. Attempts were made along the way, as you know, historically. No, we're going to make this reservation or call this Cherokee land or Sioux land or whatever else. We're going to have a treaty. Those treaties lasted 3 weeks, 3 months, not long, until there was a new treaty and a new need, or someone discovers gold in Georgia or California, whatever else. Then it really became time through with Andrew Jackson in particular saying time to go. And even when the Supreme Court ruled no, they have a right, the Cherokee have a right to be where they are, he said, well, let the Supreme Court come and enforce that. I'm going down there and we're marshaling them out. And that becomes the Trail of Tears. A number of people in that situation saw the writing on the wall and moved to Oklahoma voluntarily. Got out under their own will, made it there safely, without the agony that came with the last phase of the Trail of Tears, the people who just said, no, we're not going, or no, we're going to negotiate a better settlement. And in reading about all of this kind of thing, many of the people who were leaders of the Cherokee Nation, you and I might call now sort of 1/8 Indian and 7/8 Anglo. There had been so much intermarriage throughout the course of time from the 1500s up until that a lot of folks you might not even be able to distinguish as Native American or indigenous versus Anglo. And many of them had become prosperous and landowners and farming. The woodlands culture of indigenous people had become more agricultural, a lot less sort of moving around. So they developed that even before they learned more from Europeans how to farm. But they had already been doing it and doing it pretty well. One of the stories I heard in a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, you may have heard this, about the three sisters. The three sisters about planting. Lynn's nodding her head. What are the three sisters?
Corn, squash, and beans.
And corn, squash, and beans. And indigenous people knew to plant those all together because there's an interrelationship. The corn grows up first, the beans then wrap themselves around it, and the squash set out roots, and they all just thrive. But no, the Anglos come over. No, everything needs to be in a row, going down this way. And what you learn is an acre planted that way yields 1/3 or something of what them all planted together does. And some of those type of things that were lost. That, if you've lived here thousands of years, you sort of get that with the land. So that's one example of what we may have been able to learn from people who had been here for a long time. And I guess that's part of what it is too for me. Whoever you're talking about, these are people. These are created by God in the image of God, just like you and I are. And if we're going to love our neighbor, as I said in my sermon last week, if we are going to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, there's a whole lot better way that what happens could have happened, or in some cases not happened at all. Slavery not happened at all. That's not what you do to somebody if you want them to do it unto you. So circling back around, there are all these signs around. When I was at Swanee back in the 80s, these didn't exist because this whole project had not started. When I was at Swanee, which was founded in 1860, the Trail of Tears had happened 20, 25 years before that and more. So there wasn't any real knowledge. But my first thing was, this went right through my college town. And what does that mean? So to explore and to look at that was finding some of these signs. And in North Alabama, in Tennessee, in North Carolina, in Georgia, there you can trace it, and I'll show you some of that as it comes up here. So one of the places I started was in Fort Payne, Alabama, and you'll see a little bit of a chimney in a second. But they started here, and the trail, as they essentially rounded up people, some of them coming reluctantly, some of them being in containment camps before they set off together, some sort of going off, leaving and circling off and coming back. I mean, not everybody stayed. And it wasn't the U.S. Army often was leading this group. It was the leaders of the tribe who were being paid by the government to lead their people over there. And as things happen that way, sometimes those leaders pocketed a little more money than they could have or should have, so that everybody didn't get the right food or the right clothing, whatever. So there was, even in that all interior, there's corruption. It was just a sad part of human nature. But you would see how and sort of where they were able to track paths like this. So that's one example of a placard that was outside. This next slide is of that site where people started. So let's get everybody from the countryside here. And then once everyone's here, we'll leave and we'll go. So there are sites like that around of things that are left. So that's again Fort Payne, Alabama. Further on in Huntsville, Alabama, there's a place in what's called Blevins Preserve. It's a big acreage preserve, sort of like Panthertown would be. And part of the trail went through there. And I like to find in this the natural places. A lot of them were roads that had been sort of cart paths that had gotten paved and whatever else, and really were just roads, and so you could drive along. But I also like getting out to walk where they walked, and to think a little bit of what it would have been like in those places. And one of those was through Swanee, not out to the cross, but if you haven't seen the Swanee cross, I just had to show it off because it's really just beautiful. It's a monument to soldiers that have died in World War I or II or Korea or Vietnam and those type of things. There's all this around on the base that's there. But if you haven't been, it's a beautiful cross and a beautiful place. But from Swanee down the mountain to a town called Cowan is the old Cowan Road. As I followed the signs, they stopped on the pavement, and then you could see the road that kept on going. It's like, I'm gonna walk that. And so I just walked it for about an hour and a half in and an hour and a half out. So you can still see maybe where there have been some ATVs or other vehicles. Some of these places are sort of fire trails in the mountains. So if there is a fire, people can get out there and do it. But just to meditate on what it might have been like in much colder environments. It's a pretty chilly day. But for families to be walking along, a child saying, how much longer? The grandmother saying, I can't take another step. Where's the food? Where's the water? And how differently it was for me. I had on the right shoes. I had a full stomach. I could leave when I wanted to leave. And it just different thoughts came across. And, I tuned in my Amazon Music. I found some Indian flute music to listen to on the way, or something just to try to make it. What could I put it in that spot to be there and do that as I went along. And then there are other places, and this is the old Fort Park that is here, which was discovered, and this is an aerial view that you can see, but just like Mayan ruins that we find, or mounds, there's another culture in called the Hopewell sort of culture, and they would build these walls that went around the side of what in the middle was 50 acres of flat, beautiful prairie and pasture. And it was a ceremonial site. And you would walk in this way, and you can see how this is. And as you walked in, just like Stonehenge, on the equinox, the summer, the sun rises right on this axis. And so somehow it was ceremonial. People didn't live there permanently. But I thought, is this like their state fair? This is where they come in 2 or 3 months, and they would sell their stuff. They would be together. They would get married. They would do things. Because on this side is water and river and a steep canyon. On this side is too. So there's a level of protection that comes around with this event. And these aren't incredibly tall. These may be 8 feet tall or something like that, those mounds that come. But then you just walk through there, and it is a beautiful, beautiful landscape. This is another picture of what it is. So coming in this way and around. But just to imagine, this is what was happening at the time of King David and King Solomon. This is in Tennessee.
I just we noticed that it looks sort of like a shaped, like a birthday shape.
There was a little bit of that, yeah. And there may have been, since it is harvest and fertility and all those type of things, that may have been like that. but I didn't even know this was there until I was looking. When now you sit there and Google what are some Native American places to see in Tennessee and Alabama, until you would go. So this was like entering in. And again, this has been dormant and unused for years and years and years. The white settlers who found it thought, oh, it must have been the white settlers before us who built this, because indigenous people aren't smart enough to do anything like that. But as you just get a sense, and this is again part of the listening for me, of the culture. It just looks like a beautiful field.
Yeah.
And it is. But to think of all the people out there mingling, selling, doing whatever they were doing, was just fabulous. So the next place that we went, and this is where I met my daughter, you'll see Caroline here in a second, is in Blythe's Ferry, Tennessee. And as you can imagine, Trail of Tears, you hit up on a river, and there wasn't a bridge. So how do you get across? You got to go across at the ferry. And so there's a monument like this for each state, and sometimes more than one. And this is a list of the people, basically an auditing of those who were moved. And so you have some in all capital letters. You may not see it from where you are, but that's their Cherokee name. And there's some others: Tom Smith, Weekie Smith, Smoke, Snip, Peter Spanish, Jim Timpson, Tin Cup. I mean, just people had different names. And then you have on the side the number of people in their household, and then occasionally the number of slaves that they were taking with them. So plenty of indigenous people who were slaveholders as well, and who was in the group and who was going. And so this is the Cherokee Removal Memorial at Blythe's Ferry. And so here are the ones for each state around that are over here. And then here, I thought I had another slide that said, these are the different trails for Trail of Tears. So Fort Payne, where we had started before, that went across up to Chattanooga and out. Others that went north and over and out and down to Oklahoma. Some that started up here went down and out, because some went by river, some went by land the whole time. It was sort of the decision of that group which way was going to be safest, most expedient, all those kind of things. So that's a very interesting map that's right there on the ground, all those places. And there's my daughter Caroline, and now she came down from Knoxville. She's the missioner for youth and young adults in the Diocese of East Tennessee. And she's like, next summer I'm taking my kids on this. We're gonna, because there's so much in Chattanooga, there's so much and there's a Native American indigenous person who's a deacon in that diocese. And so she's teaming up with him to lead some of those things. And there's a story of the Blythe family. What's interesting about this for me was the Blythe family owned the ferry and had been working the ferry for 30 years. But they were indigenous, and so they got moved out on their own ferry across to have to leave. And when you think about someone like this, this is what you want, right? We're all sort of fitting together. We're doing things. This person was working with Native Americans, was working with Anglos, all the traveling, established business, can be there. Nope, you got to go to. The other thing that was interesting for me is I saw all this, and you think about the state of Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, sort of where Cherokee, Choctaw, all this. We all could have fit. We all could have fit. There's plenty of land. There's plenty of land to share. When you think about how our population is now, in particular, there's plenty of land that could have made it. So again, that's what I mean when I said it could have been better. We could have been much more neighborly. People have been migrating, expanding, sometimes violently, like the Norman conquest into England. I mean, it's not just us. Human beings have been moving around, and sometimes it's done more peacefully, and sometimes it's done more antagonistically, and we could have done better if we were going to be the Christians that we professed ourselves to be. So, switching gears. Now, this is Montgomery, where Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. was in the pulpit there in Montgomery when during the time of Rosa Parks for the bus boycott. The bus boycott, if you remember that history, was really one of the things that moved him up into being just your average minister in town to someone who is beginning to lead this. He was asked to lead this. He agreed, and really the civil rights movement began. And y'all, you probably know this too. It didn't just happen. It didn't just say, one day we need to do this. There had been thinking, planning, wondering when, training in different places like the Highlander Institute, different white people, black people, training people. So what are we going to do about this? How can we do this without causing this huge violent revolution? But what can we do to stand up for ourselves? Rosa Parks didn't just decide not to move out of her seat on the bus. She had thoughtfully thought about what she didn't know when the day would come, but she knew it would come because it happens. So she was, in those kind of ways, planned and premeditated in ways that any type of sort of planning would need to be. And in Montgomery, there is also a civil rights museum, center, memorial, just remembering the things that happened all throughout the Southeast, but particularly some in Montgomery. And so you see that you can't take too many pictures in all these places. That's why these books are helpful when you look at the Legacy Museum from Montgomery or the Peace and Reconciliation one, that you get to hear about some of these people. This is Bruce Cundler, a priest. Well, and so when I saw Reverend, I said, well, let me read some of his story. So he was a minister who believed his life must be a sermon. He demonstrated against segregated hospitals, schools, and housing. At a demonstration to stop construction of a school for black students only, Cundler, 26, lay down behind a bulldozer and was crushed. So you think of the Tiananmen Square picture from years ago where the guy standing in front of the tank? I mean, or people even now laid out in the street to say, no more oil. I mean, all different kind of things. This is, 26. Yeah. So stories of people like that. So that's the exterior of the building. And, not for weak stomachs to go into these places. I remember years ago when I was in Germany, I went to Dachau. Why would you go to a concentration camp? Why would you want to put yourself through that? Well, we have to learn. We have to listen. It's part of learning what humanity is capable of and what any of us might be capable of. And to be able to say, not for me, not on my watch. Let's not let that happen. So part of these memorials, and actually interesting, when we were there was even a black woman in town like, I don't like all this stuff. I don't like being reminded of it every day. I don't want to go in it. I just don't agree with it. So people have different thoughts about it, white or black. So then in the middle of Montgomery, Rosa Parks, the place where she got on the bus, there is a memorial statue to her. And then where she got off the bus there's a Rosa Parks museum. And so now we are moving in Montgomery to a different place. This is really all downtown. Any of you, who's been to any of these places in Montgomery? Yeah, okay. So you sort of know where some of them are. And this is where it gets hard, y'all. At this memorial, you'll see, and if John, you would hold up that picture just a little bit, you see these sort of obelisk-like things. And they're, if you think of them in a way, it's like a coffin. And these are actually, but they're hanging from above, like a person who's been lynched would hang. So at this memorial, we remember the thousands killed, the generations of black people terrorized, and the legacy of suffering and injustice. that haunts us still. We also remember the countless victims whose deaths were not recorded in news archives and cannot be documented, who are recognized solely by the mournful memories of those who loved them. We believe that telling the truth about the age of racial terror and reflecting together on this period and its legacy may lead to a more thoughtful and informed commitment to justice today. We hope this memorial will inspire individuals, communities, and this nation to claim our difficult history and commit to a just and peaceful future. So then each of these obelisks doesn't represent a person necessarily, but a state and a county. And I took it upon myself as I walked through to find the places and the states and the counties where I've been. And this is, I grew up going to Camp Michael in Toccoa, Georgia, Stevens County. Only one person listed there. Interestingly, last name Stevens. So I thought, was this a descendant in 1915 of the very Stevens for whom the county was named after? I don't know. So you'll see some of these different counties. This is the county I grew up in, Clark County in Athens, Georgia. One person. What's deceptive about this is you walk in, you don't really notice they're hanging, quote unquote, off the floor. But as you walk further down, you begin to see they stay at the same level, and you begin walking down, and you're forced to look up like you would see. Oconee County, South Carolina, right across the border. You see a few more here. I didn't find Jackson County, North Carolina. I'm thinking it wasn't there because I did look very carefully for it. Obviously, not a lot of black people here in history, but just right down the road in Oconee when you get down the mountain. And then the dates go back from 1893 to whatever else. Fulton County, Georgia. Sad to say, the one with the most names. Was that due to population? Was that due to mindset? Was it a little bit of both? Not sure. But lived in Fulton County 2 different occasions. Lowndes County, Mississippi. Columbus, Mississippi, where I was the rector for a while. And I didn't count the number of names there, but there are names. And you can see how you begin looking up at these obelisks. Habersham County, Georgia, my first church in Clarksville, Grace Calvary. Again, right down the road here near Cornelia, just south of Clayton. And again, the dates go from 1892 to 1913. And some are just listed as unknown. And this is what it looks like from one view of it. And you end up, actually you're walking down, there's a pathway under there and you walk through in those ways. This quotation from Maya Angelou is outside both of these sites. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again. That's really good. Both this quote and the other one I showed put into words the feelings of my wanting to do this part of the sabbatical better than I could. Also Montgomery, Freedom Riders. And basically as buses were being integrated, you probably know this part of history. I mean, if you lived this part of history more than I did, when I was a youngster, and I wasn't even a youngster in '61. But anyway, okay, if the buses are going to be integrated, black and white people can ride together, right? Right. But not so easy. So groups got on in Washington and would ride together all the way through southern towns. And as they got further south, it got more dangerous for them. And sometimes their buses were stopped and burned. Sometimes they were loaded on. And I thought this one person, James Farmer, the National Director of CORE, modeled the Freedom Ride on a Forerunner and was based on the nonviolent philosophy. And I said, "Oh, James Farmer." So I texted James Farmer. "Hey, did you know? Oh, I know about him. I'm glad we share the same name." All those type of things. So that was fun to have a parishioner of the same name who could identify also a Southerner. And then in Birmingham, the 16th Street Baptist Church. This was actually the last place I went on my whole sabbatical. And I really hadn't even been expecting to go in. I didn't know that they had sort of a 1-hour tour and people who would walk you through the history of this church, which is still an active parish. And so maybe that's why it really it stuck with me in those ways. These pictures aren't in a great order, so I don't know. They're supposed to be in the right order, but technology didn't quite work. One of the things in Birmingham as well at their Civil Rights Memorial is just sort of walking you through things that some of you may have seen in your life in the South. Different things, water fountain for white or for colored, and just not going to the bathroom after each other, to drink after each other, or that kind of thing. But here's also part of when we talk about what's systemic and some of the disparity that we have. I don't know if you can read this down here, but in 1950, 73% of black males worked as laborers. And the same as over here, 33% of white males worked as laborers. So is it that these other white collar jobs weren't open to people? Was it these folks didn't have the schooling to make it into those jobs? But the subtlety of those type of things of you can only work in a mine, you can only dig a ditch, or you have a chance to be a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher at a school, and how that gets into people's minds. The same over here with education. In 1944, 42.8 students per teacher in a school. How does that sound, Laura? 42 kids in the classroom? Not so good for anybody, right? She's a teacher, she knows. And in white classes, 24 students per teacher. The quality of education is better when you have a better student-teacher ratio. Just is. People don't fall through the cracks, and it's hard enough just to get everybody's attention, even if there are 24 students in there. This is, again, statistics about mortality. 46.3 per 1,000 die before year one, and this one is 30.5. So the conditions for people lead to sometimes death or just not health. So helping to see some of those things that are the remnants of the slave trade. This is a picture actually from a movie, Birth of a Nation. Remember, see this movie, Birth of a Nation? It reads, "It's a legendary film classic and a racist masterpiece. It reinforced the images of the noble and loyal Toms, black people, clownish coons, stoic mammy, tragic mulatto, and the brutal black buck. The men of the KKK emerge as heroes in this movie." So again, how culture is reinforcing stereotypes and those kind of things. Not that everybody loved this or saw it or they won an Oscar, but it was out there, you know? James Lawson, when I talk about people who helped to steer people in this, he was one of the teachers, was a guiding spirit of the student sit-in movement. He studied Gandhi's philosophy in India and returned to America to teach the principles of nonviolence. In 1960, he was a divinity student at Vanderbilt in Nashville, conducting workshops here and across the South in passive resistance. Diane Nash and John Lewis, two of his students, became important leaders of the civil rights movement. This is where people like him and others, like, okay, this is where the church was doing the right thing, or people in the church were doing the right thing. You trying to get my attention, Ellen?
No.
Okay, I thought you were giving me the eye, like,
Well,
okay.
we got a few minutes.
Got a few minutes, all
I'm
right.
just gonna move this over there.
So outside of a 16th Street Baptist Church and the Birmingham Civil Rights Center is in this park. And you may remember the water cannons that were used on the students and the dogs that were brought in. This is to remember that incident and others like it. That's the 16th Street Baptist Church from across the corner, which had been a thriving, and is a thriving church for Black people. At one point in its history, it was condemned because it was the only brick church in town, and the Black people had it, and that ain't right. And so it was condemned. They had to tear it down, and then they rebuilt it to different specifications in another part of town. So it's that kind of stuff. Like, tear me down the church? Really?
You have to have a strong gut to go through all of this. I know.
Anybody does, and even a stronger gut to work in these places. So that's the pulpit in the church where Martin Luther King had preached and Joe Biden has spoken from. And so it's a historic church in a lot of ways. So it's special to be there. It's interesting. They have this picture of white Jesus in the middle of the church, because this is the way Jesus looks. We all know that Jesus looks just like this. But this part of this in the explosion of the bomb that went off, a lot of it was shattered, including right here at the heart. Very interesting. That's what, when the bomb went off, it shattered. There are pictures of all that, maybe even in one of these books. And then this is our guide. She's pointing out that there used to be a staircase right here, and they planted the dynamite under the staircase. And the little girls in this room, using the bathroom, tying the bows on their hair, being a little late coming from Sunday school to church. And if they'd been behind this part, you may not have perished, but since they're right through the glass, they met their end. And let us remember them. Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins. I think it was last week that Rob Hunter was telling me that he knows the McNair family from his time in Alabama. So this is where my slides are out of order. Part of what happens in the Legacy Museum, which is back in Montgomery, it traces the slave trade through this period of what they call mass incarceration. And you walk through, and actually all of these images are made in Africa by a person who is descendant of people and families who were sold there or captured there to come here. And it's just heart-wrenching to think of. These are, the people across the sea, and just their heads. 12.7 million people. 12.7 million people kidnapped from Africa and brought to North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean area and other places. 480,000 of those to the United States. So this is the exterior photo of the Legacy Museum in which that display rests. Here is again that sense of looking up across the way at the Peace and Reconciliation Museum. And I thought there was one more in here, but I think I'm about to go back to the beginning. Yeah, back to the beginning. I guess one of the other words that things that end with Y that I wanted to say is tragedy. Bravery for people who stood up along the way. How this testifies. And then things that end with Y, including the letter or the word why. Why? Why? And how can it be better? How can we be more neighborly? Books that I was able to read along the way in Native American Studies, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'd highly recommend. The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Demand of Blood, the Cherokee Wars of 1776, which right around the time of the Revolution, cleared out in this area of the world, and Black Elk Speaks, which is more North and South Dakota. For peace and reconciliation, I would highly recommend the book Blood, Gun, Signed My Name by Timothy Tyson. He's the son of a Methodist minister, and their town of Oxford, North Carolina, went through a terrible situation with lynching in 1970. And he was as a son of a Methodist minister, watching his father stand up to injustice from the pulpit, and how the rest of his family was sort of led into all that. It's a great, important story to hear. Uncomfortable Conversations with the Black Man, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, and The Narrative of Frederick Douglass. As an American Studies major, I should have read a lot of these books, but you can't read it all. You can't do it all. So maybe this was the time of my life when I was supposed to dive into that anymore. We've got just a few minutes to take any questions that you would have. Sharon?
Well, I was reading an article recently of hundreds of people around the United States who ran for positions on school boards, who don't want these things taught. Governors who don't want you to mention it, governors who could be presidents. Would you just comment on how you feel about this being taught in schools?
I mean, again, just like the Holocaust needs to be taught in schools, and German schools, and American schools, and Canadian schools, this needs to be taught. I understand there's a way of teaching that is very accusatory, that is very finger pointing, that almost does the opposite of them and us, to become us and them. And I think that people who don't like the quote unquote CRT, critical race theory, which has become such a supercharged term, and you can just, like anything, you just throw it out there, right? It's like abortion. There are so many different reasons that a woman would seek this or need this in her life. It's not as simple as just saying abortion. It's not as simple as saying critical race theory. How can this not be taught? And it's not necessarily to make someone feel bad about being white or inferior to being white or being wrong. Just because you're white, now you're a bad person. That's as wrong as saying just because you're black, you're an inferior person. So I get some of the sentiment that comes with that they take and they twist and they make it the thing that they're saying the loudest, versus saying, yeah, we need to understand the legacy that slavery brought to this country. Slavery that led then to Jim Crow laws and being separate, and led to lynchings. And as I was saying earlier, it's not difficult to see where George Floyd is in the streets with a white man's knee on his neck and he dies, how that's that close to some of the lynchings that happened. I mean, this story I was reading in this book, this guy makes some comment about a white woman with a relative of three of these white guys standing right there. Well, they're going to have none of it, so they chase him down the street and they shoot him in the back. That's not even a crime. I mean, George Floyd may have been guilty of a crime. I'm not saying he shouldn't have been arrested, but no one should be apprehended and detained and treated like that, even if you've done something heinous like rape. That's unjust. And so where is the justice in that? Whether, if you want your son, your daughter, your whatever treated that way, no. So I think there is a good and healthy way for us to reckon with this part and look into the future as what we can do so that we can be one nation under God with liberty and justice for all, with everybody who's here, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your age, all those other things. So there is a better way. There is a better way. That's a long answer to your question.
Thank you for saying that.
Any other questions? Well, I see some good tartans going on here. This is nice. Little scarf over there, scarf over there. It is time for us to switch gears and make it over to church. thank you for being part of this. If you ever have any questions, feel free to come in and talk. Happy to do it and continue this journey of mine with you and how you love. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.